Welcome to part 2 of my Moka Pot mini print series. If you haven't seen part 1, make sure to check that out before I get into it. Last time, I created this Moka Pot print design using the 3D model software SolidWorks and also the illustration software Krita. Now, I'll use that design to carve each of the wood blocks for this print. The first step in the carving process was to carve the key block. To start, I'm marking out where I'm going to carve my registration marks. In this print, I'm going to put multiple carved areas on the same side of a block, so I'm trying to be really careful about how I place them. When I'm carving key blocks, I try not to stress too much about making them perfect. One thing to remember is that when you're placing the paper into the kento, the most important thing is that your paper goes in consistently. So by saying that, if your corner isn't perfectly square, it might still be alright because it will consistently line up the paper regardless. And that's the ultimate goal of registration. I'm a big morning person, so generally I like to carve before work. You can see I have my coffee all ready to go, and then the sun's coming up behind me there. I might do some kind of morning routine video in the future because that's something that I think about a lot in my personal life. If you think that might be interesting, please let me know. At this point, I'm at the stage where I'm ready to glue down the design to the block. One thing I have to think about here is that once it's on the face of that block, it's really slippery at first. So I have to be really careful not to rub the back of the paper too hard, or it might become misaligned. So I'm always really gentle at first, and then as the glue starts setting in, it kind of becomes a little more firm and I don't have to be as careful anymore. Many people have asked me what paper I use when I do these transfers, and to be honest, I usually use printer paper. I know that there's papers that are kind of made for this, or at least tend to work a lot better for this, but in my experience, I've found that printer paper works well enough and I'm able to see the design. And I also just, don't want to waste the paper that I do have for printmaking generally. So that's why I typically go with it. But I know there's better options like Gompi paper, which you may hear David Bull talk about, or I'm sure several other options. So now it's time to get into the carving. To start, I'll talk a little bit about the wood I'm using in this print because I know that's a question that I often get. To be honest, I have no idea what the wood I'm using is. I was actually given this piece of wood when I was living in North Carolina, and I'm really just unsure of where it came from. So yeah, I just went with that for this little print. And in the past, I have used the same type of wood, and I found that it worked pretty well for printmaking. The main downside was that the cut of this wood made it so that the grain switches directions many times within this block, so it makes it a little trickier to work with. I'm talking over my work a little bit here, but I'm doing my usual 3-step carving process that I've discussed in the past, starting with outlining it with the knife, and then clearing out the major areas as I'm showing here, and then finally I'll end up cleaning it up with the bullnose chisel. In this video, I'm trying a new approach to my editing where I'm really narrating over the entire clip once I've put everything together. So I am curious what you guys think about this approach. If you like it or don't like it, please let me know. Another question I get is about making mistakes with my carving. Generally, this doesn't happen too often, but actually while I was carving this key block, I split the wood in the wrong place 2 times. So generally when this happens, I use a super glue and I glue it down as soon as the mistake was made so that I remember exactly how that chip fit into the block. And then I just let it dry and make sure it's flush in its position. I have to say that this was the first time I tried doing some kind of mini print, and I really enjoyed it. It was really fun to kind of work through all the different blocks in a short amount of time, and now I'm really excited to get going with the printing. So I've been thinking I might extend this into some kind of series in the future, maybe a 4-print series of mini prints, and I'm looking forward to coming up with that. A quick side note here about why I usually use a brush or wipe down the block after I finish carving is that generally there's some excess glue left over from the pasted design, and I have to get all that off before I do my first prints. So now it's time to take some impressions from the key block because I want to get ready to carve the color blocks. So I'm planning 4 different color blocks for this print. So I made about 8 different impressions just so to make sure I have enough when it's time to highlight the prints and separate the color layers. I always like to have extra there. And then, so that's really the only reason I'm printing this now. Otherwise I would just continue on carving. And recently in a video I did get a question from someone about why I take the impressions and use those as the color transfers rather than just printing all the different layers initially and gluing them all down to the block up front. And my answer to this question is it's not a super firm answer, but I guess in my experience I like to create the carving first and define those color blocks based off of my carving, so that it kind of removes a step of uncertainty. So for example, if I did it the other way, I might make some mistakes in my carving, or maybe the line is a little bit off in my carving versus the original plan. And that would mean that all the color blocks then wouldn't line up with my carving on the key block. So that's kind of my theory, and I think it really doesn't make a big difference, but that's kind of why I do it this way, and it's simple enough to do a quick round of impressions, so I've really just stuck with that. Once all those impressions are made, it's time to do the color transfers. So I'm highlighting each region of color I want to appear on this print. And when I'm doing this, I really triple check my work, because if I color these incorrectly, I'll end up carving them that way, and that's much harder to reverse than highlighting a piece of paper. So I really take my time on this step, think through everything again, and sometimes when I'm really thinking deeply about those separations, I'll change my mind about what I want to do, because maybe I just think the colors will layer in a better way, or something of that nature. So lots of times I end up editing what my original thoughts were. But yeah, these are the 4 different color blocks I now need to carve. As I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be putting multiple color areas on this same face. In fact, I'm going to try to fit all 5 color areas, including the key block, on this one wood block. So you can see before I started marking out these registration marks, I was really laying everything out and making sure it would all fit properly. Another question I receive is about the specifics of the registration mark carving, specifically about the trench that I carved between that L-shaped Kento mark and the kind of line-shaped Kento mark. And it might be a little bit difficult to explain because I wasn't really highlighting it in this video, but the reason for the trench between those marks is that I'm trying to make space for the paper to rest in the registration marks without being interfered by raised wood. The reason for this is because those registration marks are recessed into the wood a little bit, so if you weren't to carve a trench between them, then the paper would kind of be bending around the 2 registration marks. So that's the reason why I carved the trench there, and I hope that makes sense, but I'm planning to make a more in-depth video about registration marks anyway, so hopefully I can demonstrate that a little bit more clearly. Again, I start by applying very delicate pressure with the baren there, and then I always cut off the excess paper on those transfers, just so that there's nothing kind of left like flapping off of the block. I like to kind of remove those pieces. As long as I don't remove any of those color areas, it's not a problem. One thing that's always tricky for me is when I first start kind of trying to peel off the back of the paper, I have to use a little bit of water to add some friction as I'm rubbing. And generally if I add too little water to my finger, it kind of just slides back and forth on the paper and it doesn't actually rub any of those fibers away. But if I add too much, it can wet the glue beneath the paper and cause it to kind of peel off or distort. So that's something that I've really had to dial in, is kind of making sure my finger's only slightly moist as I rub it on that paper. And eventually, once I'm able to kind of get under the paper and get that first peel, that's really 90% of the work there. And then I often, if there's a lot of detail, I might kind of rub away a little bit more just to see. But sometimes, if it's not a super detailed block, I might be able to just kind of leave it after that initial peel. Now I'm following that standard carving practice again, doing the outlining first and then the waste wood and then cleaning it up with the chisel. And generally I would say that color blocks are, of course it depends on the detail, but they might be 3 times as fast as a key block. So in this example, I would say that I spent 1/3 of the time carving these 2 color areas as I did the key block. But again, it really varies on the complexity of those color areas. I will say that for me, even the enjoyability of the carving can vary a lot based on the design that I'm working on. I've had color blocks where there's a lot of small areas to remove wood from in between details, and that can be really time consuming, and for me, not super satisfying. So sometimes I'm really enjoying the carving that I'm doing, and other times it can be a little bit tedious. So now I've finished carving those color blocks and I'm back to peeling off the leftover paper. I kind of found with this print that I can really just peel off with my fingernail the paper, and it's a lot easier. In the past, I've kind of rubbed it down to the point where the fibers break down, and it ends up spreading all the paper around the block and kind of working into the crevices of the block. So in the future, I'm always gonna try to peel it off like this and then try to rub off the residue, the leftover glue. So I've finished carving 3 of the 5 layers in this print now, and I think it looks pretty good. So now we'll move on to the next 2 color areas. Since I was able to fit the 3 layers on the first side of this block, it's now a lot easier to arrange and fit the 2 last ones onto this side. So I'm not necessarily worried about fitting them there, but instead I'm trying to prioritize finding the nice stretches of wood. In this case, I'm trying to find the smoothest grain pattern, because like I said, this wood is kind of tricky to work with, and the grain direction switches a lot. So I'm hoping to just kind of find the easier areas for me to carve. Another thing I'll point out is that I know a lot of people use a different glue to paste down their designs. All I'm using here is nori, the rice paste, the same stuff that I use to print. And for me, I've actually found that it works fine. I've heard some people say that the glue can kind of slip and the paper can move as they're going, but I've really never had this experience, and even with the fine detail, it does seem to work fine for me. So I'll just stick with it, because again, it's one of those things where if I already have the nori with me, then I'll just prefer to stick with that. I want to take a moment here to remind you that I'm not an expert in this subject, and everything I'm doing has either come from other people online that I've learned from, or my own experience and just trial and error. So I'm definitely aware that for a lot of these different techniques and tools, that there's better ways, and I might not be aware, or maybe I've just sacrificed that in favor of maybe a less financial investment, or just kind of simplifying my materials. So I just want to remind you of that, and if there's ever anything you see or would like to suggest, I would love to hear it, because I'm always kind of looking to improve. So this is the last stretch of carving here. Once I'm done with these 2 color areas, I'll be ready to make a print. One thing that's kind of funny I've found is as I go throughout the process of carving, I generally tend to speed up as I go. It's almost like the anticipation of seeing that print on paper just kind of speeds me up and takes me to the finish line. So at this point, I'm sure I'm kind of, hurrying to get done with it, waking up extra early, or trying to find time to finish those blocks. I did notice throughout the carving of this one that my carving techniques were adapted a little bit to this grain. I noticed that I was doing a lot more of kind of cross grain clearing rather than carving with the grain and making those nice smooth finishes. And that's just because the grain was switching directions, like I said, and it's hard to do a continuous nice kind of chisel run with the grain moving like that. So instead I was just going across the grain and leaving a slightly more rough surface, which I don't think will cause any problems with the print, but definitely wouldn't be preferred. So I just finished up carving those blocks, but I have to note something funny while I'm making these recordings. I did actually notice that I forgot to carve some areas on these blocks while I was editing, and you can see it right here actually in that top right image right by my finger there. I forgot to carve that little spigot out of the center of the Moka Pot, and I actually did it on the other side of this block as well. So I'm currently out of town for Christmas, but when I get back I'll just quickly remove those two areas. It shouldn't take long, but just thought it was funny because it's something I caught while I was watching the video, not while I was actually there in person. Again, I've been trying the peeling method when I'm removing the excess paper, and I just think it's crazy that after gluing down a sheet of paper to a block, peeling off the back of the paper, and then soaking it with water, I can still, pull it off in one piece and see what it is. Sometimes when I don't have my brush out, I just use the towel sitting there to help wipe off the glue. Except for those little areas that I still need to carve out, as I mentioned, this block is pretty much all carved and ready to go. Thank you so much for watching part 2 of this series. Please let me know what you thought of the video in the comments. In the next video, I'll be experimenting with different pigments that I'll use in this print. I look forward to bringing you that video soon.